So yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Commander Peter Tedman, DSM, OAM, RAN, representing His Excellency the Governor of Queensland, Group Captain Ian Carty, CSM, the Senior Australian Defence Force Officer at RAF Base Amberley, representing the Chief of Air Force, Lieutenant Colonel Clark Flint, representing the Commander 1st Division Australian Army, Mr Jimmy Ure Ovia, the Consul General of Papua New Guinea, Miss Rihanna Davis, representing Miss Annika Wells MP, the Federal Member for Lily, Ms Tara Hatzismalis, the Deputy Commissioner for Queensland for the Department of Veterans Affairs, Councillor Fiona Hammond, the Councillor for Marchant and also representing the Lord Mayor of Brisbane, Mrs Wendy Taylor, representing the President of the Queensland branch of the Return and Services League of Australia, Lieutenant Colonel Tony Coyle, the President of the United Service Club Queensland, Mr Mick Denton, representing Mr Bart Mellish MP, the Assistant Minister for Veterans Affairs in the Queensland State Government, and may I also include Captain Philippa Hay, CSC and Bar RAN, veterans, ladies and gentlemen, and school representatives. Welcome to the 79th anniversary Battle for Australia Commemoration Service. It's an unusual year we have this year, which I don't think I need to harp about. Everybody's no doubt fully aware of what our problems are. And unusually, I have to start an address with an apology. The apology is twofold. For the reason of Mr COVID, we are unable to supply morning tea this morning, and we're also unable to have the services of a school ensemble. However, the school concerned has provided us with a musical background, but it's limited to what they are allowed to do under these present circumstances. We will emphasise throughout this morning's commemoration service the fact that we are operating in the centenary year of the Royal Australian Air Force and its contribution to the battle for Australia. And I'll say more about that as we go along through this morning's service. Could I now though ask our vocalists if they would lead us in the hymn Amazing Grace. I should just add to my welcome, and I omitted it unintentionally, to make especially welcome those who are here for the first time. And you are far too many for me to mention everybody by name, but I especially welcome those schools who are new to us and those organisations also who are here for the first time. I'd invite our chaplain now, Padre David Niven, CSC, to lead us in prayer.
Thank you, Pat. I was just reflecting on the way over, Pat. I think it's nearly 10 years that I've been involved with the service here, so it's...
We'll extract our pen, please.
This will lead us in a prayer of remembrance, as listed there. At the conclusion, if you feel comfortable, please join with me in the Lord's Prayer as printed. Let's pray. Almighty God, we gather here to remember those who served on land and sea and in the air in the South and Southwest Pacific campaigns of 1942 to 1945. So we recall to mind all those who laid their lives on the line, repulsing the direct threat that was posed to Australia at that time. We give thanks for their courage in what was a time of great peril and uncertainty for our nation. We remember with heavy hearts those who paid the supreme sacrifice, those wounded in battle, those who suffered mental anguish and who never recovered from their ordeal. We thank you for the sacrifices made by all those involved in the battle for Australia, because we are the beneficiaries of their sacrifice. The peace and prosperity that we enjoy today is a consequence of what they did all those decades ago. In the years since the battle for Australia, many have suffered and died in other battles, fought so that freedom and peace would prevail in our nation and throughout the world. We pray that the giving of their lives may not have been in vain. We think of all those who continue to suffer pain, sorrow or distress as a consequence of war, and ask that you would ease their pain and comfort their troubled hearts. We especially uphold veterans of the Afghanistan war as they struggle to come to terms with the fact that Afghanistan is now back in the hands of the Taliban. May we never forget the sacrifice made by veterans and their families of all conflicts. We're mindful of the threats that continue to exist to freedom and basic human rights in many parts of the world. We pray that in the challenging times in which we live, that you will break down those barriers which lead to war, that you will restrain and frustrate the plans of those who pursue evil, that diplomatic solutions to problems would be a priority, and that peace may begin to prevail in our troubled world. Temper human pride, remove jealousies and prejudices, and increase the bonds of friendship, a willingness to forgive and mutual service, all of which will make for peace in our world. Finally, we would pray for our nation, Australia. May we be a beacon of light to all nations, strengthen those who lead us, that they may govern us responsibly and fulfil their heavy responsibilities with accountability, truthfulness, dignity and honour. Help each of us to be good and decent citizens, irrespective of our race, our culture or our religion, so that we may enjoy and promote the freedoms gained for us through the sacrifice of those whom we honour today. These prayers we offer in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ, who taught us to pray, saying, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
it's a coincidence that we have as our official speaker for this year a senior member of the Royal Australian Air Force, being the rotation as far as we're concerned. Here we rotate our speakers between the Royal Australian Navy, the Royal Australian Air Force and the Australian Army, or should I say Australian Army and Royal Australian Air Force, in turn each year. And it just so happened, a happy coincidence, that this year was Air Force's turn, if I can use that phrase, and we have an Air Force speaker. It's most important, I think, that we remember that our most junior of our armed services has been with us and supporting Australia, or protecting Australia, for 100 years. And in relation to that, we look forward to listening to this gentleman. He was posted to and appointed as the Senior Australian Defence Force Officer, RAF Base Amberley, on the 13th of January last year. He graduated from the Royal Military College Duntroon in July of 1992. After various flight command and executive positions as a junior officer, he was promoted to squadron leader in 2002. His experiences include the Chief Instructor, Air Force Headquarters, Staff Officer, Australian Command and Staff College, and Executive Officer, until he was promoted to Wing Commander on the 28th of October 2008. He was appointed to be the Commanding Officer of 2AFDS from October 2008 to October 2011. He then served as the Deputy Director of Battlespace Operations and Specialist Support at the Directorate of Personnel, Air Force, until the end of 2014, and then Deputy Director, Security, Directorate of Security, Air Force, until November 2016. He was promoted to Group Captain on the 22nd of November 2016 and was appointed the Officer Commanding Ground Training Wing on the 5th of December of that year. He was appointed the Senior ADF Officer at RAF Base Wagga in the middle of 2017 and assumed command of the newly formed Ground Academy there on the 7th of September 2018. He has seen operational service in East Timor, for which his team, 2AFDS, was awarded the Meritorious Unit Citation. He also served as the Officer Commanding Regional Training Centre team as part of the Australian Army Training Team 8 Detachment in southern Iraq from May to December of 2007. As a Wing Commander, he deployed as the Commanding Officer, Combat Support Unit, Rotation 14 in the Middle East region from October 2015 to April 2016. In 2007, he was awarded the Army Combat Medal. In 2012, he was awarded a Chief of Air Force Commendation for his exemplary performance as the Officer Commanding Regional Training Centre, and in 2017, he was awarded a Conspicuous Service Medal for his tour as Commanding Officer of Combat Support Unit 14. A graduate of the Australian Command and Staff College in 2005, he has also completed a Certificate 4 Executive and Business Coaching and participated in an Australian Human Rights Commission Inclusive Leadership Program. Would you please welcome to address us this morning Group Captain Ian Carty, CSM.
Good morning, His Excellency's representatives of the services, representatives of diplomacy and government, veterans, veteran support organisation, ladies and gentlemen, and kids from our local schools. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge those Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men and women who have served in the ADF in times of peace and war. I would also like to acknowledge the veterans and veteran support organisations that are here today. I thank you sincerely for your service and the selfless support you provide to our veterans and their families. Today, we commemorate 79 years and 76 years since hostilities effectively ended in the Pacific as part of World War II and the Battle for Australia, which marked a significant shift in Australia's defence strategy and future alliance with the US. Australia, already heavily committed in the war in Europe against Nazi Germany, was not prepared for the speed and effectiveness of the Japanese Imperial forces as they targeted Pearl Harbor in December 1941 and rapidly advanced throughout the Pacific. The 28th and 19th of February 1942, Japanese forces took Singapore, capturing over 10,000 Allied force members before attacking the Philippines, Malaya, Thailand, Guam, the Gilbert Islands and Hong Kong. They also bombed the top end of Australia, focusing their efforts on Darwin as a strategic target. The battle for Australia had commenced, and our government directed our Defence Force to be rapidly expanded, reorganised and then redeployed to directly defend our nation to the north and to support the war in the Pacific. We're all familiar with some of our defining battles, such as the Battle for Milne Bay, the Kokoda Track Campaign, and more broadly our air, maritime and land campaigns throughout New Guinea. We honour and pay our utmost respects to those Australian and Allied POWs who experienced the most horrific conditions of war as they endured captivity, worked on the Burma Railway and fought their own private war on the Sandakan Death March. We must never forget their courage and the sacrifices they made for our country. History has recorded it was the might of a fully mobilised US Pacific force with support from her allies, including Australia, which was able to take back the Pacific in a series of bloody air, land and sea battles from mid-1942 until the Japanese surrender on 15th of August 1945. Battles such as Java Sea, Coral Sea, Midway, Guadalcanal, Philippine Sea, Iwo Jima and Okinawa, to name a few. Ultimately ending with nuclear force and final cessation of hostilities on the 2nd of September 1945. Concurrently, and commencing in 1939, the construction of RAS Base Amberley had commenced, and we recently celebrated our 81st anniversary of the official opening of the base in June 1940. The base was established to support the raising of aircrews for the war in Europe and rapidly shifted focus as a key base for operational air power support to the war in the Pacific. Amberley also welcomed the US Air Corps in 1941 as they assembled both Kittyhawk and Dauntless aircraft and commenced operations in Australia and the wider Pacific. Since the end of World War II, RAF Base Amberley has continued to evolve and grow and has remained a strategic operational airbase and home to a range of helicopters, bombers and more recently strike, EW and transport aircraft. As we celebrate our RAF centenary year, which commenced on the 31st of March 2021, we also acknowledge the essential role both Amberley and her people and platforms have played in the defence of Australia, including the air, sea and land battles during the Battle for Australia. While our flying heroes are well celebrated, and we'll hear more of one later, everyday heroes also contributed to the Battle for Australia. As part of my representational duties in 2021, I have been extremely fortunate to, on behalf of the Chief of Air Force, both meet and celebrate alongside Air Force veterans who are turning 100 years old in our centenary year, and listen to their stories and service during World War II and the Battle for Australia. Veterans like Kevin Statham and Gloria Collins, both Air Force veterans who turned 100 years of age this year and have received birthday messages from Her Majesty the Queen, the Governor-General and the Prime Minister, to name a few. Kevin Statham was born in Ipswich, Queensland on the 20th of March 1921. In May 1941, Kevin enlisted in the Australian Army and served until February 1943. In April 1943, he joined the Royal Australian Air Force and was a warrant officer serving in the Pacific as an air gunner in a Liberator aircraft. He regales an incident when his aircraft, late for a mission, and during a period when it was rumoured the Japanese had taken control of a Liberator, was fired upon by his own squadron as they rejoined the formation late. It was a visiting US cameraman on board the shooting aircraft who forcibly removed that tail gunner, effectively saving Kevin and his mates. As defence would have it, the tail gunner was subsequently sent south for retraining. Kevin said they went on to complete their mission, even though his aircraft had over a dozen new holes in it and some rather agitated aircrew at the end of the mission. Gloria Collins worked in McWhirter's department store before she enlisted in the Women's Auxiliary Australian Air Force in July 1943. She trained as a sick quarters attendant and was based in Kingaroy, then the Concord Rehabilitation Hospital in Sydney and RAF Amberley in Queensland. On discharge, Gloria was an aircraft woman serving with 3 Aircraft Depot and was one of only 33 WAFs to receive good service cards for exceptionally valuable service. She received that commendation at a special parade at RAF Base Amberley, as she had compassionately and effectively helped to nurse back to good health the first POWs who returned to Queensland from the Pacific. I look forward to hosting Gloria at Amberley later in the year and showing her how the base has changed or not changed over time, while noting the old parade ground and original base headquarters do still exist presently. Any military service for your country, and in particular during war, is the ultimate test of the human condition. War and combat are horrific and demonstrate the extremes of mankind, from heartfelt compassion and sense of duty to indiscriminate destruction. So today, in addition to acknowledging the end of the war in the Pacific and the battle for Australia, we pause to remember all those who paid the ultimate sacrifice in the defence of their country, whether they were laid to rest on the battlefield, succumbed to injuries in hospital, or lost their battle much later through those deep personal injuries that could not be fixed. We remember their legacy and the reasons they fought in some of the most inhospitable places in the world to protect their mates, their families, and their country. We remember those brave thousands who lost their lives as POWs in horrendous conditions while achieving some amazing engineering feats and demonstrating the highest order of human resilience and mateship. To all the veterans who have given of themselves and their families, my sincere gratitude and thanks. Your legacy is not forgotten, and future generations will continue to honour your sacrifice, lest we forget.
Thank you, Group Captain Cardy. The next item on our agenda for our commemoration service is a presentation by a student. This was something we instituted only a couple of years ago, and I think it's become a very important part of what we do here on the first Wednesday in September every year. As Group Captain Cardy mentioned, there were a lot of good people served in the Royal Australian Air Force during the battle for Australia. One of those was a significant individual from a particular point of view. And without me commenting any further upon that, I will now ask Manat Gopal from Aspley State High School to come forward and tell us about Flight Lieutenant Bill Newton, BC.
In the legends of the exploits of Australian soldiers of the First World War, tales abounded of heroic actions of Australian servicemen braving the beaches of Gallipoli, the muddy fields of Europe, or sailors braving the treacherous sea battles of the Pacific and the Mediterranean. As generations had before them, Australia acknowledged its brave young men who marched, sailed, and fought for our country, king, and empire. But 100 years ago, the Legion of Honour for Australian soldiers was expanded to include those who find a new theatre for the danger, combat and sacrifice of war. From 1921, Australian heroes could be found not just on the land or sea, but in the sky, as the Royal Australian Air Force was created. Since 1912, only 11 years after the Wright brothers first took off, Australia had been one of the first nations to see the potential in air-based forces to assist in combat. It was in 1921, however, that this foresight was acknowledged formally when King George V granted a charter to create the Royal Australian Air Force, only the second such royal charter in the world. While the RAF expanded and increased its size and role in the interwar years, the RAF initially had the unusual distinction of having more aircraft than pilots to fly them. But it was when the path to a new global war became clear in the late 1930s that the RAF moved into high gear, as its membership, craft, and expertise all rose to meet the increased demands needed to combat the threat of the Axis powers. It was in World War II that the RAF would have its baptism of fire. When the call for aid came from Britain in September 1939, as it had so many times before, the Australian military responded for the first time, not just with soldiers and equipment, but pilots, planes and personnel, as the British faced the dark days of the Blitz. In the heady days of the Battle of Britain, young Australian pilots with newly earned wings took to the skies on sorties around the clock in hastily maintained and overworked craft against the menace and power of Germany's vaunted Luftwaffe. Many of these young pilots would not return, but they, and those who survived, had paved the path to a new field of battle, where Australian servicemen could show the courage, skill, and resolve for which the nation had become known. When the immediate threat to Britain faded, the duty of the RAF did not, as attention turned to the battles unfolding in the skies above the Mediterranean and North Africa. The conditions and importance of the RAF can be seen when it is recognized that this Air Force drew on only 2% of enlistments, yet made up more than 20% of battlefield casualties. 10% of all the pilots and crew shot down in these brutal years were those of the RAF, and like their Anzac forebears, the pilots, crew, technician, and ground staff fighting this new version of war learned the bitter lessons of sacrifice firsthand. By the end of 1941, however, the RAF found a threat and a responsibility for the first time that was closer to home in the area of the Pacific War that would come to be called the Battle of Australia. The Japanese juggernaut moving through the Pacific seemed unstoppable as the Australian government and people faced the grim reality of an all-out invasion. And the RAF would be called on to defend the nation itself, a challenge that was not shirked. While Australian divisions were urgently recalled, the squadrons of the RAF were also called on to defend home and country. Initially dividing their duties between the Northern Hemisphere and the Pacific, it would increasingly be the battle for their own land and home front that would occupy the men and women of the RAF. Whether standing guard over the Australian coastline or taking the fight to Japan in the Dutch East Indies and New Guinea, it would be the perilous days of 1942 to 1945 when the RAF would face its greatest challenge and meet it with determination. The urgent role of the RAF can be seen in the massive effort the Australian government devoted to the manufacture, production, and purchase of urgently needed aircraft in 1942 to 1944. Australia produced its first fighter, the Boomerang, to engage enemy Zeros. Membership of tactical groups skyrocketed, and while servicemen confronted the mud and disease of Kokoda and the challenge of capturing Japanese-held islands below, the skies above the Pacific saw a great number of fellow Australians fighting their own bitter conflict amid the clouds and shell bursts of aerial war. The Pacific War would see the first ever naval battle, where enemy vessels would never even sight each other, as more and more the initiative for war was being left to men in steel cages, flying with only a thin screen of cover fire and the faint whisper of radar to lead them into battle and hopefully a safe return home. By 1945, the RAF had risen to 50 squadrons, 6,000 aircraft, and 21,000 frontline personnel. By the day of Japan's surrender, that force stood at 76 squadrons, 217,000 men and women had served under her wings, and over 10,000 would never return. A nation that had been one of the first to embrace the then fanciful idea of air power a generation before ended World War II with an air force that was now the fourth largest in the world, and had endured the harshest conditions and challenge that this new form of war had to offer. Like veterans of any war, those who fought for the RAF in the battle for Australia have become the subject of tales of courage, endurance, ingenuity, and sacrifice. Of dawn takeoffs in eerie light, the flak and fire of aerial combat, where any second or maneuver can bring glory or death. Of the camaraderie of flight crews working together in the dark of the Pacific night to complete a perilous mission or achieve a safe return. Of the telltale sound of a crippling blow that will bring a once mighty aircraft and its crew to a savage collision with the ground. Heroes of the RAF include those of the Caterpillar Club, who survived a crash over land, or the Goldfish Club, who survived a crash over water, or the remarkable few who achieved both. 100 years after its inception, the legacy and role of the RAF is stronger than ever. The story of the RAF does not end with a battle for Australia, but it is the key moment when our nation looked to its brave young citizens to defend the country, not just on land and sea, but in the heavens and the skies. As with every enclave that made up the defenders of Australia in its darkest hour, the RAF responded to the awesome and new challenge with vigour, with bravery, and with commitment that meant the safety of the many at the expense of the few. Where the RAF is deployed today, those below need only look up, as did those of days now past, and see that even the sky is not enough to contain the dedication, diligence, and daring of the Anzac spirit.
I think it's worth mentioning at this stage that as an organisation we set the subject for this address, but all of the work of the preparation and everything that goes into it is done by the students concerned. So thank you, Manor. Thank you, Aspley State High School. I did mention one person I thought you might have elaborated upon. That was Flight Lieutenant Newton, BC. The reason that I mentioned him was that he was the RAAF's only Victoria Cross awardee in the South and Southwest Pacific campaign of the Second World War. His story is not one I want to dwell on. It's a rather sad portrayal of what happens with war, but he didn't survive. In fact, he was long gone before he was even able to be aware that he had been awarded our country's highest honour, Victoria Cross. We come now to that part of the service which takes a little time but nevertheless is very, very important. So I'll ask you to be forbearing in this particular part, especially as we don't have the musical accompaniment that we would normally have. What I'm talking about, of course, is the laying of wreaths. And I'll ask Commander Peter Tedman if he would lay the first wreath on behalf of His Excellency, the Governor of Queensland. To follow with the next wreath is Group Captain Carty, representing the Chief of Air Force. To be followed by Captain Philippa Hay, CSC and Bar RAN, Commanding Officer of HMAS Moreton. Then Lieutenant Colonel Clark Flint, representing the Commander of the 1st Division Australian Army. To be followed by Lieutenant Colonel Tony Coyle, the President of the United Service Club. To lead the RSL, could I call upon Mrs. Wendy Taylor to represent the President of the Queensland branch of the RSL. And following Wendy would Heather Christie, the President of Caloundra branch of the RSL, and Mr Ken Roma, President of the Kedron Wavell sub-branch of the RSL, move forward and lay their wreaths. Closely following them, could I ask Mr Bruce Milne, representing the Moreton District of the Return and Services League, to lay his wreath also. Mr Milne's to be followed by Mr Bob Standfast and Mrs Faye Coleman, representing Banyo RSL sub-branch and the Citizens Auxiliary, and with them Dr Anne Bramwell, representing the Defence Service Nurses RSL sub-branch. Following them, Mr Les Hill, representing Goodna RSL sub-branch, and Mrs Denise Busk, representing Kedron Wavell Ex-Service Women's Association. We move now to members representing different ex-service organisations. Firstly, would Mrs Wendy Griggs, representing Navy Women Queensland, and Mr Frank Aldred, representing the Royal Australian Navy Communications Branch Association, lay their wreaths. They are to be followed by Mr Bob Crawford, the President of the Sappers Association of Queensland. And I'll ask Lieutenant Colonel Steve Vokes, the President of the 9th Battalions Association, to lay a wreath with Bob Crawford as well. Before we give the Consul General heat stroke, I'll now ask the Consul General for Papua New Guinea, Mr Jimmy Ure Avia, to lay his wreath. The next group to come together, could I ask for Mr Ray Fogg, President of the 31st Battalion Association, Mr Tim Lewis, representing the family and friends of the 2nd 31st Battalion, and Mr Bill Mills, representing family and friends of 31/51 Battalion, to come forward. There to be followed by Mr Paul Woodward, representing 2549 Battalion of the Royal Queensland Regiment, accompanied by the battalion's adjutant, Captain Sonny Carino, and Mr Vince Atley to represent the 49th Battalion Association. Next up, I'd ask Mr Tony Bolter to represent the New Guinea Volunteer Rifles and Papua New Guinea Volunteer Rifles Ex-Members Association. Could I then ask to come together Mr John Burgess ED, the Special Envoy for the RAAF Association, and Mr Ross Brady, representing Pine Rivers and Sandgate branch of the RAAF Association, to lay their wreaths. There to be followed by Major Murray Nelson, representing the Army Museum of South Queensland, and Mr Nigel Cox, representing the Royal United Services Institute of Queensland. Next, could I ask Miss Rhianna Davis, representing Miss Annika Wells MP, the Federal Member for Lilly, to come forward, and to follow her could I ask for Miss Tara Hatzis-Marlis, the Deputy Commissioner for Veterans Affairs for Queensland. Next, Mr Mick Dedman, representing Mr Bart Mellish, Assistant Minister for Veterans Affairs in the Queensland State Parliament, and Councillor Fiona Hammond, representing her own ward here, and also the Lord Mayor of Brisbane. Next, I'd ask Dr Betty Lee, the author of Right Man, Right Place, Worst Time, to lay her wreath on behalf of the Coast Watchers, and Mr Mike Harris, representing the Australian American Association, if he would come forward and lay their wreath. School students are next. Could I ask Reed, Amy and Ziana, representing Aspley State School, to lay their wreath. They're to be followed by Matthew, Monique and Divya, representing Aspley State High School. One of our newbies, Maisie Lever, representing Everton Park State High School. And could I also have a student to represent Craigsley State High and another student to represent Wavell State High. And the place of honour goes to Eli Bull, another newbie representing St Joseph's Nudgee College. Before we finish with the wreath laying, I'd just like to make a small observation. I noticed on the wreath for the Papua New Guinea Consul General, which is composed totally of Australian natives, a sprig of wattle. May be of interest to some people to know that today, being the 1st of September, is also Wattle Day. Could I now ask the students Caitlin Manuel and Ike Randall from Wavell State High School to come forward and quote for us the Ode of Remembrance? Would everybody be upstanding, please?
They went with songs to battle. They were young, straight of limb, true of eye, steady and aglow. They were staunched to the end. Against odds uncounted, they fell with their faces to the foe.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
Lest we forget.
Lest we forget. Please remain standing for the last post, the reveille and the pipers lament. Please remain standing for the anthems of Australia and Papua New Guinea.
Australians, oh let us rejoice, for we are one and free. We've golden soil and wealth for taught, our home is girt by sea. Our land abounds in nature's gifts of beauty rich and rare. In history's page let every stage advance Australia fair. In joyful strength then let us sing, advance Australia fair. Arise, all you sons of this land, let us sing of our joy to be free, praising God and rejoicing to be Papua New Guinea. Shout a name from the mountains to sea, Papua New Guinea. Let us raise our voices and proclaim Papua New Guinea.
Please be seated. Before I invite Padre Neil Niven to bless us on our way, we're departing from normal procedure today to present some mementos to a number of people in honour of the centenary of the RAAF, and we think that this is a way that we can extend the memory of what we gather here to do on the first Wednesday in September each year. So I'm going to invite the Vice President of the Battle for Australia Commemoration Committee, Mick James, if you would come forward, and he will present these mementos which we trust will be displayed in prominent places in the homes that they go to. The first one is to Group Captain Ian Carty, to thank him for his service here today and his service in the Air Force throughout the number of years he's been in uniform. Could I have a representative now from Aspley State High School? As you're aware, Aspley provide the students' presentation each year. Could I now have a representative from Craigsley State High School? Craigsley, under normal circumstances, provide our full music ensemble, obviously restricted this year by the pandemic. And last but not least, Wavell State High School. I went back through the records the other day and I can vouch for the fact that Wavell, since the second year of our inception, have been the providers of the reciters of the Ode every year since. That goes back to the year 2001. Thanks, Mick. Again, before I call upon Padre David I'd like to say thank you to everybody who's been here today. It's not a thing to take lightly in the midst of a pandemic with a lot of restrictions and a certain concern for gathering. We don't look upon your attendance here as in any way to be taken for granted. It's very much appreciated, and it supports us in what we believe is our annual requirement to thank those that went before and who provide us with a beautiful day like this that we can enjoy at the start of spring in a land that is absolutely free. So I thank you all, especially those that came a long way. I think one of the longest travellers here might be my own sub-branch president, Heather Christie from Caloundra. So we appreciate that. Padre David, would you bless us on our way?
Thanks, Pat. I've chosen a very ancient blessing. It's called the Aaronic blessing, and it was first given to Aaron, the brother of Moses, many thousands of years ago. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. That concludes our service. Once again, I apologise for the inability to provide morning tea. I trust that that'll be back on the menu this time next year. I would ask Commander Tedman if he would convey our thank you to His Excellency for providing your attendance here this morning, sir, and for what he's done for us over the past 7 years. That's very much appreciated, and we wish him well in his eventual retirement. Would you please be upstanding while I escort Commander Tedman to his car? Thank you, everybody. That's the conclusion of the service.
Thank you very much.
I left you out.
Gave ourselves 50 minutes and then gave way. I can't believe it.
All right. I'll let you get started. Thank you. Can I have a look at your blood? Oh, sorry. That's good. When was it sent? All right. Take care of it. All right. Nice to meet you. In a minute, I'm going to see if this other... Are you part of the school? Yes. What's your part? I just drive the lead.